It's really a privilege and an honor to be here. I'm humbled. I'm especially humbled being around students. You've got some great students here, and tremendous opportunity with the creation of Cs. There are many potential stumbling blocks in making Cs work, and I see a lot of hopeful signs. I see a lot of signs that administrative structures have been considered that have been problematic in the past, and I wish you the very best. I'll be talking more about those administrative structures as I go through my talk. The great disruption really takes three forms. There's the great disruption through climate and biosphere disruption, and I'm going to take you through some of the more salient aspects of that have come out of the very recent peer-reviewed literature. I'm not going to dwell overly on climate change. There's so much that can be said about that, but there are a few things that I really want to emphasize. The other disruption that's happening is higher education and how we could be doing things differently. I'm going to propose disruptive higher education. Unfortunately, that's not what's happening, and I'm going to end with the political economy of higher education, which is another disruption that's actually ongoing. Higher education is being transformed considerably from something that we hadn't anticipated. Do you need me to put on the microphone? Everybody okay?
Maybe this also works.
Yes.
You don't have to talk directly.
Okay, I think I'll leave it at that if that's all right with you. Thank you. Let me begin with a quote that I've always been fond of. The very least you can do in your life is figure out what you hope for. And the most you can do is live inside that hope, not admire it from a distance, but live right in it, under its roof. The first part of that is figure out what you hope for. What do we hope for in higher education? What is our mission? Have we lost track of that mission? I think there's evidence that we have in some ways. And I would ask you to ask yourself, why am I a student? Why am I a graduate student? Why am I a faculty member from first principles in terms of your contribution to make in the dire straits of this century? This is not going to be an easy time for humanity and for civilization. So where do you stand on that? What is your hope? This quote has not inspired me, but I've always been impressed with the truth of it. The way we've structured research in organized universities is not consistent with how reality works. The sciences in universities are stuck in the disciplinary status quo they've been in for centuries. This is still true even among the more than 1,000 interdisciplinary environmental science and sustainability programs that have been created since the 1970s in the United States and Canada. Those disciplinary status quo still is there. Now, one of the things that I see in the creation of Cs is a hopeful new direction. There's evidence that you've brought together the faculty to actually reconsider how you do holistic and integrated training. So I believe it's urgent that we renew the mission of higher education, and that's really what I'm going to talk about today. I am employed by the National Science Foundation, and I am required to issue this disclaimer in writing and verbally. The views here are those of the author, my own, and do not reflect the views or policy of the National Science Foundation in any way, shape, or form. I am not paid by the Science Foundation to be here. I'm strictly on my own dime. So, done. Now, I've been accused of being an apocalyptimist. The Urban Dictionary says this is someone who knows we're in deep shite, but believes, sometimes I believe, that we will find a solution or find solutions. An associated term, hopium, I encourage you to look at that. You know, it's been rough since the election about a year ago. After the Paris Accord, I wrote a blog on my Environmental Century blogs, and I said, we've turned the corner. We know the Paris Accord is not adequate. It's going to get us less than half of the way where we need to go to stay below 2 degrees Celsius. But it's a step in the right direction, and it's the first time the nations have had a consensus. It's the first time it's really been brought together. That was a place to stand. That was a place to move from. And of course, Lucy moved the football in November, and we are right back where we were not very long ago. And there were a couple of months when I really couldn't get out of bed and fly the flag. This quote actually helped me do that. And I would like to offer it to you as a way of thinking about your personal mission at this point in time. Do not depend on the hope of results. You may have to face the fact that your work will be apparently worthless or even achieve no result at all. If not perhaps results opposite from what you expect, sounds like science, and you get used to this idea, the more and more you start to concentrate on the results, not on the value, the rightness, the truth of the work itself. So I can still get out of bed and fly the flag. I believe in what we're doing, and I hope you do too, and I hope you'll turn to that with ever renewed energy, because we simply must. There's no alternative. So let's talk about the great disruption with respect to climate and biosphere disruption. I'm going to mention just a few bullet points here that are, to me, some of the most salient take-home messages. On any meaningful human timescale, the climate of the 20th century, i.e. the normal climate, is gone forever. Gone forever. Return to normal climate conditions through natural processes will require millennia. I don't think there's any other way to return to so-called normal conditions. Get used to that idea. I'm sure many in this room are already have embraced that. Without major efforts to mitigate, the changes to Earth's systems, terrestrial, marine, atmospheric, biospheric, will accelerate in the coming decades. It's not slowing down, it's getting worse. What matters most about climate change is not the temperature change per se, or the CO2 concentration per se, it's the disruption of the biosphere itself and the resulting impacts on our life support system. And so that's where the focus really needs to be. Disruption of the biosphere will amplify climate change through massive releases of carbon to the atmosphere. Large positive feedbacks are now underway, and they are accelerating, and we are hardly ever even measuring them, much less managing them. I believe they can be managed. I'm an ecologist. I think we have some options that we're not employing, certainly with respect to forest. Because of the increasing energy in the climate system and disrupted global circulation, extreme weather will become routine, damaging human and natural systems and resulting in even further emissions from that damage. The extreme weather is really part and parcel of all weather is now happening in an altered climate, a human-altered climate. Through the second half of this century, the disruption of the biosphere will create conditions that will not support civilization at our current population level or the anticipated population level of 9 to 11 billion souls. Climate change is a defining characteristic of this century. Joe Rome said very pithily, avoiding catastrophic climate change must be the organizing principle for humanity for the next 30 years. Of course, somebody in the audience said, well, why just 30 years? And he says, because we haven't done it by then, it's over. You know, there's really game over. There's not much to talk about. I agree with him. It must be. Is it? Not yet. We're not organized yet. Now, I could show you many temperature curves. NOAA, NASA, the UK Hadley Center, the Japanese have all produced outstanding research and accumulated global temperature data. Instead, I want to show you Richard Muller's, a man that's known for his humility. He believed that all of those groups that I just mentioned were wrong, and he had to be proved. It had to be proved to him that the planet was actually warming. Well, lo and behold, after he accepted money from the Koch brothers and from the Koch Foundation, indeed, he found much the same thing, and he declared that human activity is almost entirely the cause. Thank you, Richard. The oceans have absorbed about 95% plus of this heat. Kevin Trimberth, referring to a missing heat element in a global circulation model, a general circulation model that wasn't necessarily attributed to the oceans, said something very clear. He said the heat will come back to haunt us, and that is now happening with the oceans. It's a long timeline for that heat sink, and it's underway now. Our current emissions trajectory is unequivocally catastrophic. The IPCC, the UK Hadley Center, and numerous others project 4 to 5 degrees Celsius global average by 2100. I think it's instructive to look at what's happened over the last 20,000 years. You can see that as the glaciers receded, we began to warm. This was largely due to orbital forcing. This little blip here was a function of some of the adjustments in the ocean currents and in standing ice on the continents. And then we topped out about the time we had agriculture in full swing, and then began to cool again. Again, this is a slow progression, largely due to orbital forcing, the position of the Earth in space relative to intercepting sunlight. And so we were on our way over the next several millennia to another glacial advance. Well, something remarkable happened along the way to the Industrial Revolution, and you can see the dates here. We are unequivocally exponential. Now, Michael Mann was one of the first to show this relationship, or it was used as a centerpiece in the third assessment report from the IPCC. I made the mistake of showing the hockey stick when I was giving an invited talk to a joint session of the Florida legislature. 4 minutes into my talk, I was declared a liar and dismissed. And most of that came from the Heartland Institute and from the Cato Institute. These legislators had been tutored that the hockey stick was flawed and it was a lie and that my science was bad. Never mind that the National Academy had just released its evaluation of it and that the fourth assessment report had just come out prior to that event. So the good news is I finished my talk on time. Concentrations of CO2 are higher now than in 3 to 4 million years. At least the last time concentration was 400 parts per million was during the Pliocene. The rate of CO2 release is unprecedented in at least 55 million years. And ocean acidity has increased 26%. The rate of acidification is 10 times faster than any acidification event in the oceans for over 55 million years, and quite likely for over 250 million years. Sea level is another issue. My permanent home is in Florida. It is frustrating to see how disconnected the government there is of the imminent threats to Florida. You can see the increase in sunny day coastal flooding in the U.S., and you can see the contribution driven by climate change going up. Sea level rise is driven by thermal expansion primarily at this point in history and melting of ice on land, landlocked ice. There's the beautiful paper published by Andrea Dutton in 2015 in Science, where she asked the question, when was the last time we had a temperature rise equivalent to, first of all, the 1 degree Celsius that we've already achieved, and then the projection of 1 to 2 degrees Celsius, and then 2 to 3 or beyond. And you can see that 125,000 years ago, we had a temperature rise where the concentration of CO2 was at 287 parts per million, which is roughly pre-industrial. And that resulted eventually over a century timeline or more of 6 to 9 meters of sea level rise. It happened again 400,000 years ago. We got 6 to 13 meters of sea level rise out of 1 to 2 degrees Celsius global average differential. And then beyond that, it's hard to say. The last time the CO2 concentration was at 400 or beyond was during the Pliocene 3 million years ago. We know at least 6 meters then, probably much, much more in double digits, certainly. So sea level rises and falls over centuries and millennia. You know, people that joke about buying oceanfront property, of course, don't understand the geo processes of our planet, the geoscience that's driving this. But we should expect up to 2 meters by 2100. 2 meters by 2100 will be devastating to all the coastal cities on the planet. And that's the global average. There is an overlooked ecological imperative that's resulting in species loss and the redistribution of diversity. These are the zone shifts in the color of the new zone projected by 2040. These are the classic growing zones that come from the USDA. You can see dramatic changes in the growing zone landscape. This is going to have an enormous impact on the timing of flowering and fruiting and the relationship of that phenology with the animals that depend on those things. It already is. The number of tree species and their center of diversity is going to shift dramatically between this period, 71 to 2000 to 2071 to 2100. You can see that we're losing tree species and there's going to be a dramatic redistribution across the continent. This will have enormous implications for biodiversity and species preservation. And it also has huge implications for how we go about conservation. A remarkable, very sobering paper was produced by Jenny McGuire and her group at Georgia Tech, where she simply asked the question, where is the connectivity across habitats as these zones move adequate to allow plants and animals to migrate to the preferred zone? Where does that connectivity exist? Well, as you can see in the West, it's pretty well connected because we just haven't done much damage out there, and there's vast stretches of uninhabited territory. There are sections where it can succeed only with the construction of corridors. This is for natural and semi-natural landscapes. And then the vast majority of natural and semi-natural landscapes in the East will never succeed, according to her estimates. It's a very, very sobering paper. I recommend you read it and assess it critically. Evidence that climate change has accelerated onto a new and dangerous trajectory that is really starting to pick up steam. A lot of this is our detection of it, but some of it is actually momentum that's building within the thermal inertia of the Earth's systems. First of all, we vastly underestimated the collapsing of the Western Antarctic ice shelf and associated ice shelves. We now need to double our potential sea level rise to more than 6 feet by 2100, 2 meters. The Arctic sea ice is in massive retreat. It's classically very well known that in fact the models do not predict that sea ice loss, that they vastly underestimated. What's going on there is of great interest with respect to the general circulation models. Greenland passed a tipping point in refreezing of meltwater, that balancing point where you get as much refreezing as you do melting in 1997. That's the estimate. So Greenland is in massive collapse. We probably won't lose the entire ice sheet, but even just a fraction of it will have dramatic impacts on sea level. Regardless of mitigation efforts, there will be net positive emissions from permafrost by the end of the century. Some studies estimate that this is already underway, the net positive emissions, as opposed to there being a balance of uptake and efflux. The degree of emissions depends on the degree of mitigation. If we mitigate aggressively, we'll still get some. If we don't mitigate at all, we're going to get a lot. Recent data project the permafrost thaw to be 20% greater than previous estimates for 2 degrees Celsius global warming. The loss of stored water in the Amazon basin is very alarming to me in particular, because I know this real estate, or to the extent that anybody can know a real estate so big you could fit all of Western Europe and the UK in it and still have room to spare. That's the enormity of the Amazon's contribution, literally the terrestrial lungs of the planet. The drought I remember when the first drought hit in 2005, the expert knowledge was, well, this is a once in a 500-year drought. And then they amended that and said, no, it's a once in a 100-year drought. And then when it hit again in 2010 and 2016, I think we stopped making any proclamations about how frequent it would be. Fire is now a major factor in the basin, much more so than it used to be. This is the cover of Science from last March. The amount of carbon stored in the soil is immense, 3 times that in the atmosphere. CO2 production from deep soils increased 35% when warmed to 4 degrees Celsius. The reason they chose 4 degrees Celsius is because that's the projection for soils warming at 30 centimeters down. And this, to me, was a real kick in the gut last Thursday, published online by the journal Science. This was an inventory of the net carbon balance of all of the tropical forests in the world. And you can see the Amazon basin is hugely a net source of emissions. Africa, not so much. other places spotty depending, but the overall average equals a contribution of 425 kilograms of carbon per year, which is roughly equivalent to all of the diesel burned for transportation in a year in the United States. To me, this was a terrifying result because I didn't expect to see this kind of result for another 10, 15, maybe 20 years. And it's not happening because of climate change per se. There's an element of that in it. What's real, through the fires in particular, but what's really driving it is our bad stewardship of the rainforest. Deforestation, disruption, and disturbance resulting in this net production. The good news is that could be reversed with adequate management. This paper was published by Barnowski and his group at Berkeley in 2012, and it drew a lot of fire. What they did was they asked the question, what percentage of terrestrial ecosystems have been transformed to a new state by us? And they projected that by 2025, we would reach that ecological event horizon where there would be a point of non-return for 50% of the planet. That's a fairly profound statement. I don't care if it's 2030 or if it happened in 1997. What I care about is this. All of this data point to one fact, one reality. Restoration to a past state is simply unrealistic. We should stop even talking about that on a global scale. And our goals must be to maintain ecosystem form and function and preserve as much biodiversity and carbon holding capacity as we can in the biosphere. I'm not saying walk away from endangered species and consign them to their fate. I'm saying preserve as much as you can, but your real goal is to manage the ecosystems for their form and function, because that's how we will maintain the most biodiversity in the long run. And that's my opinion. So let's take a minute and talk about the mission of higher education during the Great Disruption. This is the defining era for our species and for higher education. We stand in a lecture hall of one of the greatest enterprises of higher education ever erected in the history of humanity. That's something to be proud of, but it's also something to guard zealously, to protect and to preserve. And the question is, where are we at right now in that mission? How does it operate? I'm first going to tell you what could be, and what is SEAS in particular, and the College of the Environment at the University of Washington and other places are attempting to do. But I believe that higher education has an ethical obligation to lead the development of the foundation of a sustainable civilization. This is part of our charge as part of the public trust. The legal concept of the public trust goes back to Roman times, and the concept basically says that some functions are held by the government for the good of the people. And higher education in the United States post-World War II was one of those functions. It was created as part of that public trust. And nobody batted an eye. And the public still sees it as part of the public trust. It's not funded as part of the public trust anymore. It's urgent that we produce practitioners able to integrate knowledge from multiple disciplines and understand trade-offs among solutions. This is the model that is typically used by the academicians that are trying to create these integrated programs. The social ecological system, this comes from School of Natural Resources and Environment at the University of Florida, and certainly they stole it from someplace. And so there's social processes, human components, there's ecological components, ecological processes, there's political and economic conditions, which are weighing heavily on us at the moment, and large-scale biochemical like conditions, biogeochemical conditions like climate change. And then there's the integration that we must be all about to produce effective practitioners. I far prefer this model, where we have a social foundation and then an environmental ceiling and then a safe and just space for humanity, for civilization to operate. That social foundation is really what higher education should be all about establishing. It's true we are exceeding this environmental ceiling in almost all of these, in my opinion, although quantitatively you can build an argument that we haven't quite exceeded it in certain areas. We're so close as to, it just doesn't matter. So the social foundation, income, education, voice, jobs, social equity, gender equity, health, food. Those are the things that these interdisciplinary programs really must concern themselves with. And that involves the integration of disciplines that typically are not at the table, even for the interdisciplinary programs that have been created since the 70s. I think that building a sustainable civilization must be the overarching mission for higher education, and I think we're failing at that. Again, I laud what you're trying to do with C's. The devil is in the details. Integration of environmental and sustainability programming across the curriculum. What does the evidence say? We've collected enormous amounts of data on this, and I'm just going to show you the tip of the iceberg. There are over 1,000 interdisciplinary environmental and sustainability programs in the U.S. and Canada. These programs have unequivocally failed, for the most part, to provide holistic practitioners because the academic silos limit the development of integrated curricula, and the degree programs themselves are poorly designed. They're designed to be a smorgasbord of existing courses taken off the shelf from the traditional disciplines, frequently with maybe a capstone course and an introductory seminar, or maybe a seminar once a semester. I'm sorry, that's not the kind of integration we need. We need faculty that are speaking from that point of deep integration and convergence of scientific disciplines in every one of the courses that our people take to the greatest extent possible. So there are a lot of different administrative structures: an institute or a center, a school or a college, department within a college, units spanning IES program, interdisciplinary environmental sustainability academic units have taken a lot of different forms. I've directed 3 of those forms, and Shirley Vincent is an enormous source of data for this. She's got a wealth of information, and we published a paper in 2015 where we showed pretty conclusively to us anyway, that the vast majority lack autonomy and equal status with the traditional disciplinary units. What we did at Unity College, much to my astonishment, after 6 months there, I went to the faculty and I said, let's adopt the U.S. National Academy's framework of sustainability science as the framework for all of our liberal arts programming. And that was quite a shock to ask something so big for a new president right out of the gate, but they didn't tell me it was impossible. And so I tried. To my astonishment, the faculty voted unanimously to do it. And they understood that this meant that to develop sustainability science education and research would focus on the complexity of the interactions among economy, society, and nature, to propose concrete solutions that affected our very survival as a civilization. Now, they had also understood that this would require investment, and I understood clearly that it would require investment in the humanities, first and foremost. Not STEM, but the humanities. Sustainability science is knowledge for mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. It's endorsed by the U.S. National Academy, the Academy of Science, U.S. National Academy of Science, NSF, and the AAAS. The contrast between these modes of training are illustrated by Kajikawa's figure, in which he showed that the way we normally do things is we have a problem and we bring the experts in the various disciplines together to address the problem. Well, after a couple months, they've effectively defined the word model, and they're ready to go on to the next topic. I think you get my point. It's very tedious, very difficult. The other model is to have problem-focused education. Now, it's not the end-all and be-all. There are pedagogical flaws in this, but it is far, far more effective. The student becomes the knowledge broker, and the faculty become the curators of access to the knowledge. The days of there being a wizened professor at the front of the room that owns the information are over. However, it seems we continue to act like those days still exist. Those days don't exist anymore. What we need to do is be training our students in how to effectively get this information at depth, integrate it in a problem-focused curriculum. This is called by NSF and MIT and various other forward-looking programs around the country as convergence. It's a transdisciplinary synthetic framework for addressing complex problems. It's characterized by deep integration across the disciplines driven by a compelling problem. The foundation skills come from the humanities and social sciences. Arnon White at Arizona State has been a leader in thinking about how you develop competency for linking knowledge to action. There's nothing in here about integrating a differential, about solving a differential equation. There's nothing here about understanding a general circulation model. These are all affective processes that happen inside the organism and among organisms. The humanities and the social science provide these transferable skills. We talk about jobs. Well, if you talk to employers, what they really want are those transferable skills. They would also like us to do the on-the-job training for them, which we are happily doing now in many places. Critical thinking, written and verbal communication fluency, media literacy, ethical context, and management skills. I'm speaking largely at the undergraduate level now. The liberal arts model provides the pro-social, think citizenship, foundation that's necessary for effective environmental and sustainability programming. Every one of your graduate students that's doing this kind of work came in the door with that pro-social foundation in some form or another. I love Alvin Toffler's quote where he says, the illiterate of the 21st century will not be those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn, unlearn, and relearn. So what are the components of literacy in a sustainability curriculum? Well, the foundation is the liberal arts pro-social foundation, superior written, verbal, media, and quantitative literacy, normative competency, which we rarely teach, which we rarely get into, understanding ethical and political context. I can't tell you the number of times I've seen graduates go out into an environmental impact firm or another environmental agency of some kind, and they're confronted with their first ethical dilemma, and they don't know how to think about it. We need to be giving those tools. We definitely need to be giving them information literacy, essential to support critical thinking. How do they know which information is valid? How do they assess its quality? How do they integrate it? The transdisciplinary sustainability science is problem-based pedagogy requiring the integration of the disciplines. But ecological and sustainability literacy should be a minimum standard which every student should have or they can't graduate. The National Council for Science and the Environment is now developing those national standards. And I urge you to support that effort ongoing with NCs. The Great Disruption. So let's talk about the third aspect of what's going on, and this is what is in higher education. There could be multiple talks, there could be entire courses, there have been multiple books written about this. Most of them are very unsatisfying to me. There is a book written by a scholar from California called The Great Mistake, Critical Studies in Higher Education. I encourage you to read it. He starts out the book by saying in the last chapter he's going to tell us how to solve it, and then when you get to the last chapter he says, well, I was wrong. I really don't know how to solve it. And that's going to be my disclaimer right now. I'm going to lay some grim stuff in front of you that I think is real. And I'm going to say, I think we can find a solution, but we've got to step up our game collectively as academics. Higher education is no longer funded as part of the public trust. The public thinks we are, but they're wrong. 17% of the general fund from the University of Michigan comes from state coffers. If you actually make that a percentage of everything, every dollar it takes to operate UM, it's somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 6%. That is not funding at the level of the public trust. Public higher education will be soon wholly privatized and commercialized. In most states, the legislature has to vote to allow private operation of a public institution. They have had that vote in Michigan some years ago, and it's also happened at numerous other for numerous public institutions nationwide. One of your former presidents referred to UM as a public-private institution. What the hell is that? I'm sorry. The baccalaureate is a commodity. Using big data, students are now managed as consumers and their tuition and loans as financial assets. I did it. You know, I looked at what our loan base was, what was our discount rate. We did everything we could to keep our discount rate as low as possible, and did our very best to make sure that all the students were deeply informed as to the consequences of student loans. This is a private college. those financial calculations were critical to our survival and critical to the students' survival, and I'm deeply unsatisfied with the outcome. Public funding for the Academy will continue to decline. All expert assessment to every paper, every book that you read will tell you that that's true. Maintaining academic freedom and independent research will be increasingly problematic, even if through errors of omission. So you know there's money available if only your research would be in a certain area. Okay, but would you actually be doing that research if you truly had independence and access to the kind of funding that you need to do what you really think is important? Programs are increasingly evaluated on a return on investment. The dean or the vice provost comes in and says, okay, so how many students did you graduate? What kind of jobs did they get? How much money did you bring in the door in terms of out-of-state tuition? What's your balance sheet look like? How much are you costing us? Are you a revenue sink or a revenue source? No program director should have to answer those questions if we are truly part of the public trust. Universities will be dependent on corporate partnerships. They already are to a large degree. You've got them right here in numerous guises. They're very common. Revenues from increases in tuition. Tuition is now unsupportable in my opinion. Intellectual property is a very big deal. Universities are making money hand over fist for certain intellectual property rights. It depends on where you're at and how good they've been at securing those intellectual property rights. Non-academic activities, think sports, think real estate, think market investments, think goods and services to students and to the communities in which these universities reside, and philanthropy. Shortly after I arrived at Unity College, I saw the opportunity to cultivate and secure a $10 million gift, which I did. We were very fortunate, but as anybody who's had a big gift or even small gifts knows, there is no such thing as philanthropy without strings attached. That family had very clear ideas of what we should do. The next gift I got was the order of $3 million, and that donor had very clear ideas, even more so. After we got the gift, she'd call me like every other week and say, what are you doing? So, needless to say, I was grateful anyway. Financing through corporate partnerships will drive higher education to become focused on producing students for specific markets and corporate needs. These are temporary. These are temporal, ephemeral things. What you need to be emphasizing are those transferable skills at the undergraduate level, because when you really talk to the corporate executives and the managers, that's what they really value. That's what they want. Of course, they'd also like you to do their on-the-job training for you, which is, in fact, we're obliging. We're doing it. Corporations have now moved offices into major Big Ten university departments. They now have permanent office space, and they're coordinating many activities with those universities. So my point here is that higher education does not have a business model problem. It has a mission problem. When I was president, I would go to the Council of Independent Colleges, I would go to the Association of Governing Boards, I would go to the New England Association of Schools and Colleges, which accredited Unity College and Harvard, and I would rub shoulders with other executives, and I got to know the other executives. I also did some of that in my board service to the Association for the Advancement of Higher Education, ASHE. And the one thing I kept hearing from the executives, they'd always say, well, what's your business model, and how's it working? Well, the business model I found to work is to put your eye on the horizon and really believe in what you are, and then sell that to the people that want that. That's what we did. There's a very interesting story I'll just tell you briefly. I hired a marketing firm in which everybody was under the age of 30. And the head of that firm looked at me at one point and he said, we will rock your world. I said, oh, really? And they actually did. He had some red hot, brilliant talent in his team. And they redesigned the college website, they redesigned our marketing materials, we got rid of all of our printed stuff, recycled it, no more printed stuff, everything done online with search engine optimization and social media. And we were 170 beds light, and by the time that had rolled out, we were 30 students more than we had capacity for. And that's revenue. That keeps you alive. So the mission is what we defined first, and then how to roll it out. We got clarity as to who we were. Parents would come to the college and they say, I love the sustainability science mission. Never mind, they may not have understood that, but it had meaning to them. It touched them affectively. So there is a campaign against expert knowledge in the United States and elsewhere. There's a cult of ignorance in the United States, Isaac Asimov said, and there always has been. The stain of anti-intellectualism has been a constant thread winding its way through our political and cultural life, nurtured by the false notion that democracy means that my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge. I'll never forget the time I had I gave a public climate change talk in Maine, and a gentleman in the audience stood up and he said, I've read a book, and he says, you're wrong. And I could tell, I'd actually read the book too, it was awful. I could tell from the audience's reaction that this man had credibility equivalent to my 35 years of scholarship. You know, so what's happening with this? Well, the dude said it best, you know, that's just like your opinion, man. There have been three trends that have eroding respect for expert knowledge. Some of it quite politically motivated. Postmodernist philosophy, which I think has some value, but it has been construed to say that it holds science to be a cultural construct, and thus arbitrary. Religious fundamentalism has vastly limited what can be studied and learned by certain segments of our population, and politically driven cultural polarization is by far one of the most important aspects of what's going on right now. So let me end with some affective suggestions. We could talk about program development, we could talk about the machinations of administration, we could talk about student recruitment, all of those things. We could talk about pedagogy. How do you create a truly transdisciplinary curriculum? I'd love to have those discussions. But what I really want to talk about is what we're facing and how we as scholars and students, how we feel about it and how we can respond to it in the conduct of our daily affairs here at the university. So bear witness, above all, bear witness. Document the losses and identify the agents, and don't be reticent. Scientific reticence has no place in what's happening right now. Tell the fact-based story. Make sustainability teaching and research the framework for the mission of your institution. All areas of scholarship and research can find a home. I'm not saying that you give up on pure research or pure science. I'm saying identify the appropriate context for the work that you know how to do and apply it to that context. Teach the necessity of ecological connectedness. The lack of ecological literacy drives me to deep despair. Research should provide the means to preserve and manage ecosystems, active management for form and function even as they are disrupted and extinctions ensue. This is the order of the day. Keep scholarship and science alive, preserve data and share it, continue your research and teaching and being a great student, even with more purpose and integrity than before. You will not be adequately supported. You aren't now. Do it anyway. We need it. We need you. We need you. All hands on deck. Support the humanities, first and foremost, the fields that create in affective realms. Musicians, poets, artists of all forms. These intellectuals provide meaning and context for our science, and they maintain the fabric of humanity. We are obligate social primates, whether you like it or not. And our affective connections to other obligate social primates is what really matters. So I'm fond of saying that as a scientist that does sustainability science, I can tell the students what to do when they get out of bed. I'm married to a brilliant, well-published poet, and she can give them a reason to get out of bed. But I can't do that based on the science that I have. So develop detailed and flexible professional development programs. This is a big missing piece. Students at all levels, associate degree, undergraduate, bachelor's, master's, and PhD are terrified. They're fearful. We need to be bringing in, some cases, outside professional guidance to help them make decisions about where they belong. Learn effective and affective communications. expect sometimes brutal backlash. I've experienced that, Michael Mann has experienced, others have. Institutions should provide training for their faculty in communications. Push back with facts and realize that the messenger is as important as the message. We need this PR by our expert community. We need to engage them. And we need to take those faculty that don't know how to do this and teach them how to the greatest extent possible. Cultivate humility and compassion. Why are we here as scholars and students? What's our higher purpose? What's our ethical obligation? So you disagree with the faculty member across the Commons who is a postmodernist. Does that mean you can't work with them? I mean, really? How do you treat them when you encounter them in the coffee shop? So you think that your neighbor who voted for Donald Trump must be really stupid. Well, it turns out that the data suggests that that's not the case. Where's the common ground? Where's the community that you can build? You know, I'm preaching and I apologize. Study and foster cooperation. This is an art form, this is a science. Shared beliefs and motivation can drive us to savagery, such as we've seen, or to astonishing degrees of cooperation. Faculty are a community. Faculty are powerful. Any faculty in here comfortable with that statement? What's your sense of community? Are you taking care of one another? Do you know any faculty member that might be impaired by alcohol and drugs? Have you made any effort to help them? Do you know any faculty member that's living with ongoing long-term depression or maybe other mental illness? Have you reached out to help them? What do you do in the Faculty Senate? It sounds like the Michigan Faculty Senate has done some important work. I can tell you that the faculty senates that I've been elected to have been worthless. They've dealt primarily with trivia, and they have avoided the difficult issues. So, are we a community? Are we powerful? We should act like it. We've got some house cleaning to do, in my opinion. Of all of the workplaces that have been studied in the United States, the academic workplace ranks among the top 3 for bullying. I have been bullied numerous times in my career by administrators, by other faculty, by senior faculty. It's not at all uncommon. It's been part and parcel of the landscape, and learning how to live with it and respond to it is one of the most important things you can do. Finally, remember, as a gentleman raised this issue at the end of Michael Mann's talk, we are part of a larger community, and we need to build that community. Bill McKibben gave me this meme. If you are, it's not uncommon for someone to come up to me after one of my public talks and say, hey, where can I move? Get away from this stuff. The answer is any place there is a strong community, and if you don't have a strong community, for God's sake, build one. Don't discard it. That's what's happening in Gainesville, Florida right now. I'm enormously proud of that community and the way it's come together in response to white supremacy and the academic community and its outreach to the larger community. I'm going to leave you with this quote from Wendell Berry. If we are looking for insurance against want and oppression, we will find it only in our neighbor's prosperity and goodwill, and beyond that, in the good health of our worldly places, our homelands. If we were sincerely looking for a place of safety, and many are right now, for real security and success, then we should begin to turn to our communities. Thank you for letting me share with you.